My name is Ntloyi Motsamai. I'm a member of the National Assembly of Lesotho and a member of Pan-African Parliament. I trust that we had a restful night and you are ready to hit the ground running on this last day of our conference. And today we are having two technical sessions, and we are going to have to give 1 hour to each of our sessions because they are going to follow one another. And this is a slightly different arrangement from the one that was anticipated that they were going to run in parallel. So the first session is how to fight stereotypes and xenophobia. And we are going to have presentations by our panelists, Ms. Bianca Robertson, Associate Protection Officer of the UNHCR Regional Bureau for Southern Africa. And the other presenter is Dr. Martin Nziribira, Senior Manager, South African Human Rights Commission. So we are going to have the presentations in that order, please. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to engage with you in this interactive technical session on fighting stereotypes and xenophobia. And of course, because my experiences with the South African operation under the UNHCR, I'll use quite a few of the examples from South Africa. But of course, we would like to engage with you as the Pan-African Parliament on best practices in your countries. And of course, the discussion that we will have after our brief remarks is most welcomed. I'd just like to start off with a thought on stereotypes and xenophobia, and of course related to that, xenophobic violence. That combating these issues, it has to be done through a mix of strategic measures at different levels. And of course, no organ or entity can replace the lead role that the government should play as the institution which is legally mandated to ensure that law and order should prevail. And more importantly, the protection of lives and property of people when affected by xenophobic violence. The causes of xenophobia and all the related intolerances are deeply rooted and are also linked, of course, to socioeconomic challenges. And this cannot be addressed by one entity. So while government takes the lead role, a collective approach is of course required. And key role players are of course the various government departments in each country, civil society, the UN agencies, academia, and of course the communities themselves have a role to play. In the South African context, we can say that the government has taken serious measures and that there are achievements in the prevention and the response to xenophobic violence. Notably, in 2019, the South African government has successfully launched the National Action Plan to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. This, of course, was not a small task. It took many years of engagement with Parliament and, of course, with members of the public. And finally, on the 25th of March in 2015 this year, the National Action Plan, which is dedicated to ensuring that programs are in place to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, was launched. So the work has just begun. And of course, as I said, a collective approach is required for the successful implementation of such a national action plan. In this regard, UNHCR in South Africa has contributed technical advice and guidance in the drafting of the National Action Plan. And in terms of implementation, we now hope to support as far as we can with the implementation work. In South Africa, the UNHCR is also the chair of the UN Protection Working Group. The UN Protection Working Group is a coordination body which meets on a regular basis. It consists of key government departments, UN agencies, civil society, NGOs, and diaspora. This body is the coordinating body for South Africa in terms of prevention and response to xenophobic violence. We are happy to say that the South African Human Rights Commission is a key member of the UN Protection Working Group. And we know that, of course, in the African context, the promotion of rights is important, but at the same time, the promotion of responsibilities is also important. And this is the framework of the Protection Working Group, that we also promote the responsibilities of all persons to respect and abide by the laws of the country. So the work of the UN Protection Working Group has been multifaceted. In addition to information sharing, we have also engaged with the communities on the ground. And one of the key best practices that we have noted when it comes to combating stereotypes, xenophobia, and xenophobic violence is the solutions at the local level, the solutions in the communities themselves, the solutions at the grassroots level. So when it comes to the prevention of xenophobic violence, there is a tendency to work top-down, whereas we've noted that the best practice, it's more to work from the bottom up, and to look at what solutions are available in the community themselves. What we've noted as a best practice is engaging with the people that have the knowledge of the local structures. For example, your local political leaders. In South Africa, we call them ward councillors. And we also engage with our traditional leaders. And we know that in the African context, traditional leaders are essential when it comes to engaging with communities at the grassroots level. So that is my point that I would like to emphasize, that we have to look at the local structures. There's the assumption that the local structures are not resourced. Yes, that could be true in terms of the finances, but in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the importance of the communities at the local level, I think that they are well resourced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Honorable colleagues, I would now like to give the floor to the next presenter, Dr. Martin.
Honorable Chair and honorable members of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for inviting the South African Human Rights Commission to be part of this very important meeting, where issues of migration that are affecting not only South Africa, but many other countries are being discussed. I think that I'll also start off by just giving a brief overview of what we think should be done to deal with issues of intolerance and xenophobia, and of course the stereotypes that arise out of that. And a lot of what has been said by my colleague from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees are issues to which we subscribe to, and so I'll try to avoid repeating what she has said, but we do take on board and agree with many of the approaches that she talks to. Now, in the issue of fighting or dealing with stereotypes and xenophobia, there is a role for national human rights institutions which are present in most of the countries that are present here today, or that are represented here today. And one of the issues in addressing issues of stereotypes and xenophobia are that we have to understand what the problem is, where the issues come from, and what the reality is in order to address the issues adequately. And one of the first very important facts that we must acknowledge is that migration has always been a part of human existence. It's not a new issue. Human beings have migrated, sometimes forced to migrate, sometimes out of voluntary migration. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, they estimate that 258 million people around the world do not live in their countries. And that is roughly 3%, or estimated at least the last count at about 3% of the world's population. And those numbers are not likely to reduce. People will continue to migrate, especially as modes of transport become more affordable, much more faster, and they will migrate further away from their countries of origin. And we have seen that people migrated during slave trade, forcefully taken to other parts of the world. We have seen, even in prehistory, when they tell us that historically people migrated from Africa to Asia to Europe. Then we've also had recently people from the African continent and people from Asia migrating to Europe, sometimes in very dangerous conditions to get to their destinations, and a lot of them lose their lives in the process. But what is important is that there is a recognition of the need to protect migrants in terms of international law, in terms of international human rights treaties that have been signed since 1948, starting with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that migrants and their rights, migrants needs to be protected to the same extent that nationals of countries are protected. So in granting human rights, on guaranteeing human rights to all human beings, there is no distinction that's made in these important treaties between migrants and non-migrants. And so rights are supposed to be enjoyed without distinction between nationals and non-nationals. Now, national human rights institutions, which are guided by the Paris principles that relate to the status of national human rights institutions, those are the Paris principles of 1993, require that these entities, that's national human rights institutions, should play an important part in the protection and promoting of the rights of migrants. And maybe very quickly to tell you what the competences and responsibilities of these entities are. Number one, they are supposed to advise governments and other competent bodies on the rights, on human rights issues. They are supposed to promote and ensure harmonization of national legislation and regulations, on human rights issues. They are supposed to ratify human rights treaties. National human rights institutions are supposed to submit reports to different UN agencies and other bodies that deal with the human rights issues. And they are also supposed to cooperate with state entities and to help to formulate programs on, how to deal with human rights issues and, issues of publicization of human rights. And they are also supposed to deal with handling of complaints that are brought before them. And in all those activities, migrants are not excluded from how human rights institutions should promote human rights. In 2015, in Belgrade, Serbia, a declaration on the protection and promotion of the rights of refugees and migrants was signed by national human rights institutions. And in that declaration, they undertook that they would promote the lodging of complaints by migrants, that they would monitor and assess the treatment of migrants, that they would oppose statements that are made which violate or can statements such as hate speech or discriminatory practices that undermine the rights of migrants, and they would condemn violations of the rights of migrants. And they also undertook that they would oppose the issue of using security measures or protection of borders to undermine the rights of migrants. And then there have been a number of other activities that have happened. For instance, dealing with issues of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of migrants according to the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration. There is a need to shape public discourse on issues of migration. And then, of course, partnerships within national human rights institutions. Now, talking from the South African Human Rights Commission, it has played a role in establishing a number of the key regional, sub-regional, and international bodies that deal with issues of protection of human rights, where issues of migration are dealt with. For example, it played a role in establishment of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. It has also played a role in the establishment of the network of African National Human Rights Institutions. And it has recently, in 2017, played a role in establishing the SADC Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions and Ombudsmans. And in these entities, of course, if I may state, the South African Human Rights Institution has chaired all these bodies at different times. And in all these entities, issues of migrations are issues that arise and that are constantly being, efforts are being made on how to address those issues. The South African Human Rights Commission has, for example, on its part, dealt with issues of laws and policies that address issues of migrations, and it has contributed to the drafting and adoption of the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. It took part in the World Conference Against Racism that took place in Durban in 2001. And perhaps of note is that in 2008, following attacks on non-nationals in South Africa, the South African Human Rights Commission investigated the matter and then looked at the issues, what happened before the crisis of 2008, what happened during the crisis, and what happened after the crisis, and then wrote a report out of that, which we consider our seminal report on issues of migration, especially on issues of xenophobia, and how a country or how South Africa should deal with them. And then made various recommendations to government departments, so the Department of Human Settlements, the Department of Home Affairs, the Police, the Department of Justice, Department of Education, and even the Commission itself, the South African Human Rights Commission, on how it can help to address issues of migrations, issues of stereotypes. And then in this year, the South African Human Rights Commission was designated as the National Preventative Mechanism on issues of OPCAT, the Optional Protocol on the Convention Against Torture. And so in that new designation for the Commission, we are supposed to monitor detention facilities, so police stations, but also detention facilities such as the Lindela Detention Facility in South Africa, and look at the conditions of detention and also what's happening in there to ensure that human rights abuses do not occur. Now, I'm almost in the conclusion, but some of the challenges that the South African Human Rights Commission has picked up over the years and which need to be directly dealt with is, number one, is there's a need for proper identification of problems around, stereotypes and, migrants. There is a need for education programs, and those are some of the recommendations that we've made over time. There is a need for greater involvement of local government in dealing with these issues because they usually arise at a local government level. And then there's a need for greater integration among the different role players, which is an issue that was also raised by my co-panelist. And then there's a very clear need on how to deal with issues of migration. There's a need to have clarity on how to do that, so that it's not, so that there's no lack of clarity or inconsistent in how matters are dealt with. Of course, migration policy should also be very clear and, of course, fair and in line with international law. And there's a need also, I think, to highlight the positive contributions that are made by migrants. And that, in conclusion, reminds me of a poster that was developed by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, I think in the 90s, in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a poster which for me is one of my favorite posters. It's a poster showing the picture of Albert Einstein, the famous scientist. And I think it says something, it has words to the effect that a refugee is not someone who always comes with a bundle on his head or something like that. And it says Albert Einstein was a refugee. So it's important to highlight that, migrants contribute positively to society, because sometimes that lack of information is what leads to a negative reaction and stereotypes against migrants. And then maybe food for thought as we move into the discussion is that South Africa, for example, has 268,000 refugees, at least recognized refugees as far as I'm aware. But you hear more challenges around this than in other parts of the continent. Uganda, for example, is estimated to have 1.7 million refugees. Kenya has, I think, about 471,000 refugees, and Tanzania about 350,000 refugees. But in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, you don't hear the kind of challenges that you have in South Africa and in some other parts of the world. So I think it's very good for us to look at comparisons between what happens in one country and what happens in another, and why is it that we don't have the kind of tensions that you have in some societies and yet they are lacking in other countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, for these insights. Honorable colleagues, we have just had insightful and informative presentations from our panelists. And in brief, what has been said is that this matters borders on law and order, which is the responsibility of the government, because they're about the protection of the people and their properties, and they're driven by socio-economic challenges. And these are complex matters which require partnerships. A collective approach is quite key in dealing with these matters. The state agencies need to come together with government departments, and members of parliament also have a role to play. And that in South Africa, UNHCR is instrumental in implementation of some of the strategies that seem to have an impact in bringing about the change. And it has also been noted that in most cases, the approaches that are taken are mostly top to bottom, as against the preferable ways of approaching these challenges, from bottom up. And also the importance of the traditional leaders has been alluded to, especially in dealing with the communities on the ground. And we have also been made aware that migration has always been part of the human life, and that it is driven by various reasons. And it has also been noted that the migrants find themselves in precarious situations, and therefore, as such, they require the protection of the states. Their needs and rights have to be protected. And in that case, we need to uphold the international instruments in play, make an effort to domesticate and make them operational, so that the human rights of the migrants are protected. We need to identify the problems, and there's need for information and education, and also the clarity on how to deal with the problems of migrants and refugees. Now, maybe some of the things that we need to mention in our interactions, in our deliberations is if you think xenophobia against migrants, refugees is an issue, and if it is, what have you done about it? And also would like to have exchanges on the country experiences. If you have any frameworks, legal frameworks in your respective jurisdictions dealing with these issues, these are some of the things that you may want to flag out for others to know, the good practices that you have in your countries. Now it is time for comments, questions on the issues that have been presented to the meeting this morning. You can just indicate by show of hands if you have something that you want to share with the meeting. I've seen South Africa and colleague, not very far from member from South Africa. We'll start with those two in that order, please. Oh, I've seen you, honorable member from Congo.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I think that certainly the South African delegation notes the concerns of our fellow colleagues in this chamber that's been expressed over the last 2 days. I think one of the challenges we find is how do you determine who is really a refugee and who is an economic migrant? South Africa has a history, an unfortunate history, of tremendous disadvantage of the majority of its population. And that disadvantage has not disappeared over 25 years. It was created over hundreds of years. So we have a scenario of a tremendous, one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world in terms of people that are still locked out of economic opportunities in this country. And what we find is that although there might be 290,000 or so asylum seekers or refugees, we have many, many more economic migrants. And this is part of the challenge that we have, is how do we measure exactly how many there are? I mean, we've had pronouncements in this country by the police minister who said there could be over 10 million. Some people say about 4 million. And the fact is we don't know, because people are coming across the border as economic migrants, and it makes it a very challenging thing to manage. And so I was encouraged yesterday to hear about the measures being put in place to actually start to determine how many refugees and asylum seekers are really there. But our big challenge in South Africa is really economic migrants that are coming in, that they are not genuine asylum seekers. And what is happening is they are clogging up our appeals process. So in South Africa at the moment, you have your full set of rights, of refugee rights, and those are respected. But when you come into when you apply and you admit that you're an economic migrant, those economic migrants come through the refugee system, and they're openly stated as such, and then they are rejected, and then they go into the appeals process. And that appeals process currently has around about 190,000 backlog in terms of the number of appeals. So it's a challenge that I don't believe South Africa could necessarily face alone. And I was very encouraged to hear over the last 2 days that there are moves to look at economic support for countries that are bearing such a burden, because at the end of the day, South Africa has a massive challenge in terms of just bringing the majority of its population back up to par. with what you would say is perhaps a middle class or livable lifestyle. And we're talking about 11 million unemployed people. So my submission is, it's not a simple matter that genuine refugees come in and are victimized. I think it's a very real challenge of economic migrants that we have. And it is only natural that those economic migrants are looking for the same opportunities that our previously disadvantaged and even currently disadvantaged populations have. And so I'd just like to make the international community aware of this dynamic that we have. And this is what creates the conflict. And it's a very difficult thing because we're dealing with not only xenophobia in terms of social cohesion, but a history of racism as well. So in our national action plan, it's about xenophobia, it's about racism, it's about tribalism, and all of those elements together. So it's a very complicated cocktail, and I think sometimes it's presented in a very simplistic way. So this is our challenge, and I think South Africa is certainly very keen to receive the full support of the UNHCR. I know that they are trying to help with the backlog of refugee appeals. It is just a massive problem. We really do have, we have very large borders, thousands of kilometers. It's impossible to manage them all, and people are coming in. And this is really what's creating the tensions. It's a very real problem. Thank you.
I don't know if another colleague from South Africa would like to come in now or probably later after the interventions from members from other countries. Okay, thank you.
I'll come in later.
Honorable colleague from Congo. Congo.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had been following scrupulously the presentations, the interventions of our two panelists. I'd like to share a little bit of contribution. I am going to talk about xenophobia and other stereotypes or stigmatization. Xenophobia takes its origin from the Greek xenos, a stranger, foreigner, and phobia, which is fear. Generally speaking, we do not fear our own parents, Madam Chair, our compatriots, because we know them. Yet we fear foreigners. Why? This stems from ignorance, and all stereotypes or stigmas stem from ignorance. This is we need to fight this plague, because we believe that media have crucial roles to play. The media, one of the most powerful weapons of information and transformation of people and civilizations. For us parliamentarians, we need to multiply such kind of fruitful encounters. We find ourselves in this kind of meetings, and after meetings, we eat and we've got tea breaks. I firmly believe, Madam Chair, that we should try and familiarize ourselves more. I've made an observation whenever we go and eat, and also in intervals, you'll see all the delegations are grouped into familiarization, the way they know each other, from the countries, country by country. We need to mix and try to know each other, and this will combat our own differences. For us, members of parliament, we need to add more meetings, and we need to transcend our own differences so as to educate our own constituencies. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, the history of the world has demonstrated that this plague of xenophobia and stereotypes are exacerbated through socio-economical crisis, because we always think that our issues are caused by foreigners, and this is not justified, it's unjust. Revered colleagues, as parliamentarians, when we are faced with issues of xenophobia, let us take courage, let us take heart to tell politicians and populations to not delve into popularism, to avoid such kind of amalgamation, to accuse foreigners as sources of our own issues, our hardships, our difficulties. But we need to go to the causality. This is a small contribution, Madam Chair, and I thank you.
Morocco.
Thank you, Chairperson, and also to the moderator, and thank you also to the doctor who presented to us earlier. I would like to interact and also to share the experience of my country to integrate the refugees in the economic strategies and also the efforts that have been exemplary to overcome the stereotype of all refugees that have reached our borders. As a matter, can you hear me in English? Please continue, sir. Can you hear me? Please go ahead, sir. Yes. Yes, please go ahead, sir. Therefore, I'm going to repeat myself. Thank you to the moderator, and also thanks to the interventions presented by the professor. My name is Farouk, and I would like to share the experience of Morocco and its government and the civil society and the human rights organizations to integrate the refugees in the strategic development objectives in order to change and eliminate the xenophobic fears, and also to fight these stereotypes and stigmatization. The question that we ask is that how can the refugees a source of development to the economy? How it is important to examine the refugees as a source of economic power. Morocco is the first country in Africa that ratified the Shuribl for 1951, which also identifies the types of refugees. And I will try to use three lively examples. We have got a Syrian restaurant, and also that there is three cooperation between Yemeni individuals, and also another example that I can that is Gloria, which is ran away after the 2011 of Côte d'Ivoire from the Ivory Coast. In Rabat, that there is a small restaurant in the capital that was established in 2015 by a number of Syrian refugees, and through the participation of a construction company that funded the restaurant. And in this restaurant there is Syrian refugees and Palestinians and also individuals that are citizens of Morocco. This has been a very exemplary good opportunity to create jobs for our locals because the refugee inside the kingdom, an opportunity to cause change that will enable the citizens to find work. And also we are working to change a number of the laws. We find that there are 3 Yemeni individuals that were not able to establish partnership companies, but through a parliamentary intervention and a legislative change, we were able to effect that change for the foreigners to establish partnerships among themselves. That means that the refugee is no longer a burden on the Moroccan kingdom, but he has also participated in the change of the legislation for more economic participation. And the third example was a failure in the beginning, then it became a success story. Gloria has left from the Ivory Coast and was and also that she was able to work in a hair salon, and she really suffered, and she was unable to find a source of income easily there. But due to the fear of others and the xenophobia among the locals, and also from the competition to open a hair salon in terms of that neighborhood was very difficult, and the xenophobic movements and that stereotype was causing a lot of tension, and they portrayed an image of her that was unacceptable, that they tried to expel her and to evict her from her shop. And the National Council of Human Rights has interfered in this case because she is a specialist in the hair cutting and a hair salon for African hair types, which is something that is unique and not available in our country. Gloria was able to take images of the hair salon pictures that was able to distribute it, and that means that through those images that those who want the specific type of haircuts can call me and I will do it in your own shops, and was able to success and was highly welcomed by the locals because she was able to be integrated in the Moroccan community. Thank you for listening.
Colleague from Zambia.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. My name is Roger Smowa. I am a member of Parliament and I belong to IPU and the Committee on International Humanitarian Law. What beckons my heart so sad is that South Africa xenophobia attacks is not happening for the first time. It happens from time to time. This time, it was that bad. 2008, another attack. Now, when you talk about refugees, we know that the economic refugees, the ecology refugees, political refugees. What is sad is that when you hear the Deputy Minister of Police in South Africa almost coercing fellow South Africans to fight the refugees, it was very clear. Honorable Bongani made it very clear. It was all over in social media. Then you ask yourself, is this the issue that has to do with the local people at the local level, or it is the issue that has to do with the executive plus legislators who are in this August House? Because if the issue is that there are foreigners in South Africa that carry guns, if there are foreigners in South Africa that have taken over the business and stuff like that, that are illegal, where are your systems? Where are the systems of South Africa? Where is the immigration system to nail down those that are not supposed to be here? Where is your system to bring the culprits to book, those that are carrying guns? To me, that's a major issue, because if we have a problem in Zambia of foreigners, then where is the law? Where are the courts to deal with those people? Because whether refugee or not refugee, if you are in conflict with the law, you should be dealt with by the law. But if we incite innocent South Africans to fight innocent Africans by our own executive, then we come here and talk about Ubuntu in one breath. In the other breath, we are inciting. That's not right. That's not the Ubuntu. And if we're going to move forward from here, if you're going to have let's have a roadmap. The question I have is, what strategy, what methodology have you put in place to avert this problem? I can give an example of where I come from, but I think that is, Madam Moderator, is deeper than the issue from the way it looks like. I can talk about what we are doing in Zambia, blah, 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 but at the end of the day, it's my brothers and sisters here in South Africa, how they look up at a foreigner. What measures have you put in place as government to deal with this problem? If somebody is being bent in the streets of Cairo and Lusaka, I will see the police flying there. If the police are not enough, I will see the soldiers flying there to combat the situation. I never saw that in South Africa. If the deputy minister of police was the one who was inciting, because that when how I wish we had the time to screen that on the screen, so that this August House could see and hear that is totally inciting the people. Is that the way we should go? Is that the way we are going to fight the problem of economical refugees? Is by killing them, inciting the fellow Africans to kill fellow Africans? No, I want to see South Africans coming out to say they are sorry for what happened, and this is the roadmap. We're going to do A, B, C, D, so that it does not occur again. But if we're going to hide in the leaves, when the wind blows, you'll be exposed. What have you achieved? Nothing. I think here is a question of accepting the problem and saying sorry to each and every African and telling us the way forward as Ubuntu, so that tomorrow it doesn't happen. But if we're going to hide in the leaves, the wind will come and will be and remain without those leaves. So I feel that let's call a spade, a hoe, a spoon, and tell us how to move forward from here.
Thank you, honorable colleague. We don't have much time to ourselves, so we have to be brief and to the point. And may I make a special plea, honorable colleagues, that we try to highlight good practices in our respective countries and try to share with others, so that from this meeting we are able to take back home with us the practices which we found quite useful. I've seen a colleague, yes, right there. And then I'll have Honorable Connie, Cote d'Ivoire.
And Senegal.
Senegal.
And South Africa. And South Africa.
Colleague before South Africa. South Africa will be the last. Thank you. Yes, colleague, yes, I've seen you. Algeria, is it? Yes. Algeria, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. And in the beginning, I would like to thank all those who have intervened in terms of the regrettable xenophobic attacks that is witnessed in many member states. And we are here in this conference, which is a conference that has a humanitarian dimension. Yes, there are a number of African countries that are exerting a lot of efforts in order to eliminate the burden for many of the refugees. We know what's happening in Rwanda and Uganda and other countries in Africa, and we sincerely hope that this will be an example for all other countries. And as a matter of fact, that the refugees problem, which was examined, is specifically the attacks that took place on the foreigners in a number of African countries. And we have also examined the reasons and the causes behind such tension, that most of what was stated by the media, that a number of those individuals and refugees have arrived to find a source of income and to achieve wealth at the expense of the locals, which is in effect a social and an economic reason due to economic crisis and to the conditions by which many of the member states that are suffering from. So therefore, such attacks are economically driven, and that's why we here today as MPs, we could work collectively to find that our governments work effectively and observe how the implementation of laws could serve the refugees and serve the ability to integrate them and to offer them the priorities required, especially in the workplace, and affects their livelihood, so that they can become a source of income and wealth to the member countries that they visit and that they are refugees at. I also would like to allude to the role of Algeria, which is today has got some of the oldest refugee camps in the world, and the Algerian government has played a critical role in looking after those refugees from the medical coverage and integrating them in the workplace and allowing them an opportunity to become a member of society and an effective member. For example, then some of the members that I would like to share with you in this intervention, that the number of the refugees, of Syrian refugees in Algeria today have exceeded 40,000 refugees, and a number of them are now currently part and parcel of the society, and they are fully integrated, and they work, and they have their own companies or shops, and they practice their lives in a very natural, as if a natural manner, no different from any Algerian. They have been integrated and married from the Algerian woman, and their children are in the schools, and these are very good indicators of our societies. And also we have the Sahrawi refugee camps, which exceed 173,600.
Yes, okay.
Submission.
More than 173,600 refugee, and they also have had the medical coverage, and they are part of the society in a natural manner. I would like also to allude to the role that the Algerian government plays in terms of the neighboring countries, which are going through crisis and instability that reflect negatively on their societies and on Algeria itself. More than 5,000 kilometers of Algeria with the coastal countries and the member countries from the south. And these borders require a huge amount of effort to control the borders. And Algeria, thank God, plays a pivotal role with other countries to achieve stability and security, especially in our neighboring Libyan country, which we hope that safety and security will go back to normality, and this will eliminate the burden, the insecurity and instability in those countries. Thank you very much.
Honorable colleagues, brevity, please. Senegal.
Merci. Hier et avant-hier, on dit
Sorry, Madam Chair, we had a small glitch. I thank you, Madam Chair, for the floor. Okay. Populism and racism is none, and everything that is being done against foreigners is none. The threat against Africans and fights between Africans, it's not something that we should gloat over. Xenophobia against people and xenophobia in between Africans has to be condemned. There are images which are being circulated where policemen are taking migrants from Mali and put their own feet on top of their head after having beaten them bloodily. This must not happen in Africa. We need to speak the truth. We need to tell each other the truth. We need to avoid the generalization. When there's a crisis in a country, we should not say the whole country is racist and xenophobic. This is not absolutely the truth. We need to avoid the logic of revenge. We should not go and attack other citizens of another country because your citizens were attacked in that country. What I condemn is the reaction of our institutions. And when there was a crisis of xenophobia in South Africa, SADC should have called a summit in between countries which have got extraordinary solidarity in the fight against apartheid and the liberation of South Africa. Likewise, with the whole African continent, which supported the SADC countries for the liberation of all Africa. The African Union should have convened a summit to deal with a xenophobic crisis. It's not the first time that we have refoulement of repatriation, massive repatriation of African immigrants. We should be ashamed, and this is the shame that we need to manage. People are being fought against throughout the world. Africans should not fight against themselves. We've got the reasons to team up together, shoulder to shoulder. We share the same traditions. Africans who are dispersed throughout the continent. In Tunisia, the president of the Ivorian associations was stabbed in Tunisia, and these Tunisians are the racist Tunisians saying that Africans should go back to their own countries. Everywhere we are in Africa, if Tunisians, those who have committed those acts do not feel that they are Africans, we need to remind them. Africans need to remind them. Everywhere in Africa, we are Africans. We must not ask Africans to consider themselves foreigners. Where should we go? We are all Africans. I believe these are pertinent questions. This is a Pan-African parliament. Somewhere, somehow, we believe firmly in Pan-Africanism. We need to stand shoulder to shoulder, team up together to stand against China, India, the United States, instead of being balkanizing ourselves into small states and to go back into our poverty and sufferings against our own brothers and sisters. I thank you, Madam Chair.
in his submission has mentioned the SADC and AU, but the main question which we have to respond to in this gathering is what is the role of Parliament, what is the role of members of Parliament in combating xenophobia? Honorable Connie, Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the floor. I am not going to go back to what I have said yesterday. I've said that my country is one of the most open countries in Africa, in the western side of Africa. We have got Moroccans, Senegalese, Burkinabe. Côte d'Ivoire represents Africa in itself and even Europe. And I do not believe fundamentally that we have issues of xenophobia in depth. The economy is widely open. We are in clear liberalism, open politics. The society is open as well. I believe that everyone feels at home. In contrast, we've had sporadic movements of xenophobia at a predetermined period. I'm going to underscore the causes and to come up with some effective proposals. Firstly, political reasons. You know, when political classes fail, they go back into nationalism and they are attacking those who are not original citizens, as a justification of their own failure. That is how in 1998, you have noticed the serious issues of ivoirité created in all small pieces to categorize the Ivorian society and to exclude and attack a huge number of non-nationals and a category of some nationals. And it provided what you know as waves of violence and return of some neighbors to their home countries. You're going to notice that during the period of 2000 and 2001, there were some political classes to come up with some nomenclatures in Côte d'Ivoire with the presence of foreigners on Ivorian soil, Europeans and even Africans. We developed nationalism just to embrace a sort of kind of populism to attract some constituencies for electioneering funds. These people had not even any notions of Côte d'Ivoire, and these are the people who were not even from Côte d'Ivoire. I'm not going to go back to the history of Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire was populated by all the neighboring countries of Côte d'Ivoire. We are the least placed to reject other people. We have economical issue. We need to face each other. We need to look at each other in the eyes, one another. I believe when we open the economy to the non-nationals, we need to have some clauses which protect the nationals, the citizens of the country. Because most of the time in the economical sector, when the nationals are being looked down in some sector, honestly, it's going to create a global feeling of reject, and politicians, populists, will grab that opportunity and to create sort of hatred against foreigners. With a phenomenon of farming in the north, in my region, for instance, there are some feelings of hatred to other communities. Some are coming with their own head of bulls, and we have this kind of feelings that the peasants are the ones who have issues with the justice. They are the ones who are being imprisoned, and I'm not saying forcibly that this is the truth, but this is what we have noticed. And this procreates sort of revolts in the villages. For some of the brothers who come with their own head of bulls, we need to fight against corruption. I believe within our own constitutions, within our own laws, we need to be honest and sincere and genuine. We need to protect the non-nationals. We need to open the economy. But we need to protect the nationals in some specific sectors so that the politicians may not use these kind of failures to create fire. I thank you, Madam, and I'm convinced that we may continue the debate beyond this plenary. I thank you, Madam.
Over there. Before South Africa, the lady.
No, she's not speaking.
Okay, South Africa.
No. South Africa, please.
South Africa. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. The President of South Africa, Dr. Cyril Ramaphosa, dealt with this matter at the level of Parliament. He sent envoys to different African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, and others, expressing the apology and explaining what exactly happened. And leaders from those countries appreciated that and understood the gravity of the problem. For an honorable member to make such a statement causes a lot of confusion, and I must say it is totally unacceptable, irresponsible, and dangerous to make a general statement saying even the executive of the South African government seem to be involved in this. It's totally irresponsible. And I want to make an appeal, not only to the honorable member, but to the House at large, that South Africa is part of the world, and it has never happened that a decision was taken to target any foreign national in South Africa. It has never happened. So to make such statements is very irresponsible and uncalled for. Madam Chair, the government of the Republic of South Africa has an obligation to grant protection to refugees and other persons in need of protection under the UN Convention, such as the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. We are part of the world. The issue that relates to the Deputy Minister having incited people, like an honorable member is saying, is totally untrue. And deliberately misleading. I therefore make an appeal again. Please, can we work together on issues of this nature? When Doctor was making a presentation there, mentioned that the issue of migration and refugees is as old as the mankind itself. It is our issue. It is our problem. Let's work together to deal with it. Pointing fingers, it's not going to help. There are many issues that one can raise, how many people died and so on. That was very, very unfortunate, and we don't want to go into that. Better, let's try finding solutions together. That is my appeal, Honorable Chairperson. The president of the country has reassured fellow African countries that South Africa is committed to Pan-African unity and solidarity. And we will put that into action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, honorable colleagues, with your submissions. It is time now for our panelists to respond and to add some of the issues that they may feel after your interventions that they need to emphasize. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you very much to every member here for your submission. I've learned a substantial amount from you, especially the best practices that have been shared, and I've noted them with enthusiasm. UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, we stand ready and we are committed to support all governments throughout Africa, including, of course, South Africa, where my office is based, to address violence, but also to prevent it. And I noted the important submission of engaging with SADC. That is quite important for Southern Africa, but then of course the AU as well, as the overall for the African continent. And what I do recall is that with some of the xenophobic violence that we experienced this year, that the African Union has spoken out and condemned the incidents of violence that have occurred. So that is also important. And of course, as I introduced earlier, the issue is very complex when we talk about stereotypes, xenophobia, xenophobic violence, and social cohesion. And what I note is the Pan-Africanism approach that many of the members here have called for. It is one of the key solutions that we can keep in mind. In the South African context, we have had several interventions led by the government, but also with the support of the foreign community themselves in South Africa, and that includes the diplomatic community as well. We've had the Inter-Ministerial Committee on Xenophobia, which was established. And through that, we've had so many effective activities that were implemented to prevent and to respond. I'll give you an example. We had equality courts that was set up in 2015. And these were specialized courts that dealt with the prosecution of crimes related to the violence against foreign nationals in South Africa. So that was one of the best practices that worked extremely well when it was implemented. So if we draw on past experiences that worked well, and if we duplicate that, and if we continue to apply those approaches and activities, I think that we will be more effective in South Africa to address the issues, but also to prevent any incidents of violence from occurring. And then, of course, you know, when we talk about the political aspect, it's also complex. And that is why, in the South African context, we are fortunate to have the South African Human Rights Commission, who practices oversight. And through the South African Human Rights Commission, we are able to not just practice that oversight, but also to have mediation in place. And sometimes mediation is an opportunity for addressing the causes, as well as looking at the solutions. And I would also support the submission from our member from Algeria. The livelihoods integration in countries are so essential. And I think that, yes, both refugees and migrants do have a positive contribution to any economy, and that should be utilized. In the South African context, we focus a lot on livelihoods as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, with keeping in mind that it's not just for the benefit of refugees and asylum seekers, but also for South African people as well. And then I would like to also emphasize the need for the implementation of education support programs and information dissemination, which is geared towards prevention and social cohesion. And I would also like to emphasize that the discussions with media should be ongoing, because usually we engage with media after incidents of xenophobic violence, whereas the discussions should be part of preventative responses, whereas we should engage with media houses, editors' forums, to combat challenges such as fake news, which is a reality, especially with social media, and often used as an instrument for fueling violence or instigating violence. And so that ongoing discussion with media houses is so essential. And then, of course, to emphasize that every country has its challenge and every country has its best practice. And with the South African context, we know that there are many, many local South African people that have condemned the violence, that have actually started campaigns saying that we will not have violence in our name. So you do have parts of society that are very proactive in speaking out, but also acting to protect refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in the country. And then just to add one last point from my side, I firmly believe that the Global Compact on Refugees is also an opportunity for us to look at how we can combat xenophobic incidents. That shared responsibility that the Global Compact is calling for, it's an opportunity. Thank you very much.
Dr. Zibera?
Thank you so much for the presentation and for the various inputs of honorable members. And I will just again touch on some of the matters that were raised, of course, as briefly as possible, because we are mindful of the time, I understand. And maybe I will deal with the key elements that came out in the different honorable members who spoke. I think the first one came from the honorable member from South Africa, asking about how to distinguish between economic migrants and maybe, for lack of a better word, real refugees, and also the implications of large numbers of migrants in a country and the impact of that on socioeconomic rights of citizens. And I think that that is a major challenge, especially of distinguishing between real refugees and economic migrants. And it's not a secret that South Africa has a large number of economic migrants from neighboring countries and beyond. And I think that that remains a major challenge for, how to address that issue. But it's not only a uniquely South African challenge, it's also in other countries where people seek asylum, but they will not say that, straight up that, I'm seeking this asylum for economic reasons, because in many cases maybe that will not qualify. So it is a challenge, but it's a challenge that, as the honorable member spoke, indicated that it's not a challenge that can be addressed alone by South Africa, because it's an international, I think, challenge around that. And the honorable member from Congo spoke about the need for, dealing with issues of ignorance, the role of the media, and parliamentarians, and the need to interact more greatly to understand each other. I think that that is a very important part of how to deal with issues of stereotype and xenophobia, because a lot of issues of stereotype and xenophobia arise out of lack of awareness of the other person, the other group. And when there's greater interaction, it helps to deal with those boundaries in all levels. So that is why in my presentation I indicated that in some countries, and I quoted Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, there's a greater interaction between the nationals of those countries and those who are refugees in those countries. And that probably helps to build bridges. And so there's a need for those countries where issues of stereotypes and xenophobia persist, for them to learn from those other countries where there is a greater level of interaction. And we heard about instances raised by Morocco and Algeria of where there's greater integration between refugees and of foreign migrants and national communities. And then there was an issue raised by Zambia, and I've not skipped over the Morocco issue. I think I've acknowledged what was said. And the issue which was raised by the Zambia, the honorable member from Zambia, about the executive inciting violence. And I would like to agree with the honorable member from South Africa who spoke, I think last, if I'm not mistaken. And I can say that from the South African Human Rights Commission's work, and the Commission has been dealing with issues of xenophobia and attacks on foreign migrants for quite a long time now. We've never come across a situation where there is an executive decision or approach to issues of xenophobia and migration. It's just that when it arises, there's an effort to deal with it, but there are recommendations that have been made by the South African Human Rights Commission, which we would like to see implemented by the various government departments to ensure that this matter is dealt with not in a reactive manner, but also in a proactive manner to try and address issues of xenophobia and attack on migrants. But where there are instances of members of even the executive or members of local government, mayors, where they assign or where we receive cases or complaints, or even on our own initiative, we have dealt with those issues, and we have even taken them as far as to the courts of law. And I'll give you one example where a matter involved the son of a former head of state, and he made some comments that were considered hate speech. And that matter is a public matter. It was taken up to the Equality Court, one of the courts that deals with these issues. And a finding was made against that person, and then they were made to pay a fine. That was a matter involving hate speech. So there's no fear or favor or prejudice in how the Commission deals with matters. So if it's a member of the executive who has made comments and we've received a case, we deal with such a case. But it's not because it's matters that are, is an executive, decision, or it's an executive as a whole. But it's individuals who may make, comments or behave in a manner that is against human rights, and we deal with that as it arises. Then I think there was also an issue raised by Algeria about the implementation of laws that, again, greater integration of refugees in Algerian society, successful integration of refugees, and the need for, and I think the honorable member from Senegal discussed the issue of the need for the African Union to have a conference on xenophobia and related intolerances. I think that would be most welcome, because as one said, that this is not a uniquely South African thing. It may be that, we've seen instances in South Africa, but also historically, when you look at other countries across the continent, there have been instances of xenophobia. We must, I think, be, true to that. I mean, you see that in Nigeria, there was instances which, against Ghanaians in the, I think, 70s. There have been those instances in Uganda versus, I can say, Rwanda. You've had instances of Kenya where, you know, there were issues against Ugandan migrants in Kenya. There were also instances of which you can call xenophobia, not necessarily attack, but stereotypes and all that in Zimbabwe against Mozambicans. So it's not just a uniquely South African thing, but it's also an issue that we've had, and there's a need to acknowledge that that happens. It may not necessarily always result in violence. And perhaps also where we see instances of violence, for example, in South Africa, they have occurred in a time of social media. And unfortunately also social media sometimes, in as much as it does a lot of good, there's also unfortunately abuse of social media and using it in a manner that takes issues out of context. So for example, and without being defensive of those who did you know, horrible things recently, there were social media clips that were sent following or during the xenophobic attacks that happened recently, which actually did not arise in South Africa. Some of the things were happening maybe in also continents outside of Africa, where, you know, incidents unrelated to xenophobia, but which were portrayed as if they were happening in South Africa. So, and that raises the issue of fake news, which feeds into this and then, you know, unfortunately makes the situation worse or seem worse. Yes, I think in short I've captured the key elements that were raised by members who spoke. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much, honorable colleagues, members of parliament, for showing a keen interest in this session, which highlights some of the challenges that go along with the phenomenon of migration, which is inevitable as it is part of life, and it has been there since time immemorial. It is quite evident that we'll always have migrants, we'll always have refugees. All we need to do is to try find ways and means of managing these challenges. And as it has already been mentioned, we need to go into partnerships. We need to uphold and domesticate the international instruments, and we all have a role to play, especially members of parliament who have powers to make changes through legislation. I think what did not come out quite strongly is that we also have to deal with the drivers of these challenges. We have to deal with the causes, and we really have to take this with us and always bear in mind that we have a role to play, and it starts with all of us. Can we now put our hands together for our panelists for leading us in these discussions? Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the next session, which is on how to develop legislation and build adequate frameworks. We have two presenters for this session. Can they please come up this stage? Thank you very much. Panelists for the next session, please. Our panelists are here, honorable colleagues, and we'll go right away to this session. I wish to repeat once again, the session is on how to develop legislation and build adequate frameworks. How to develop effective legislative frameworks to address situations of forcibly displaced people and statelessness. And to listen to our first panelist, who's Ms. Emmanuel Mite, the Regional Statelessness Expert, UNHCR Regional Bureau for Southern Africa. You have the floor, madam.
Mesdames et messieurs les parlementaires, bonjour.
Ladies and gentlemen, the parliamentaries, good day. It is not about for me to do another presentation about statelessness, but just to give a framework to our discussions. But I will propose that these discussions may be guided by a presentation that is going to be to appear on the screen. I also wanted to clarify that in the month of May, the Pan-African Parliament gathered in an ordinary session and adopted some recommendations and resolutions. Recommendations on refugees and displaced people, and a resolution about statelessness. These documents were shared with you for information. We're talking about the documents that has already been adopted by the Pan-African Parliament at the beginning of this year, May 2019. Just by mistake, it says a draft, but it's not a draft, but it is a resolution that has been adopted by the Parliament. And about statelessness, as you know, yesterday we spoke about this. We defined a stateless person as a person who has no nationality. And the correct definition you can see on the screen, a person that is not recognized by any state as a national or citizen by its legislation. There are two categories of statelessness. In fact, there's two categories of statelessness. There are people who are stateless. They are on a territory, or they are born. They don't know any other country. These are called in situ stateless people. And another category we call stateless migrants. So these are people who are taken in a movement, and then they reach a territory and they have no bond with the territory. Why am I speaking about these two categories? Because the answer of states in order to end statelessness is not going to be the same as the apartheid, the stateless of in situ or migrant statelessness. As you can see on the screen, the objectives concerning how to work on questions of statelessness, and the objective is not only to work on it but to eradicate it. So you've got two sub-objectives. The first one is prevention, how to prevent that people become stateless in your country. And another objective is the solution to those who are stateless. So those who are stateless on your territory and migrant, the solution is protection, to give them a status of statelessness. Now, how do you give stateless? You give to a refugee a status. You do not make him a citizen, but is given a particular status. And when it comes to in situ statelessness, it means the state where he finds himself has made the person stateless. So we have to regularize the situation by allowing the person to acquire a citizenship. So we've got different objectives according to the categories of statelessness and the laws that are different according to statelessness categories. So to prevent statelessness, we are going to talk about the law or work on the law on citizenship. Remember, the law on citizenship is the direct cause or the defiance of the law of statelessness, leads to statelessness. So yesterday, the representatives of Senegal underlined that there are other rights that have the impact, the law on registration of birth. There are also other laws which shuts down or covers the defiances of that law in order to avoid statelessness. In order to reduce statelessness or to give a citizenship to the stateless institutes, so we need to remodel the laws on protection of children and so on. So when it comes about the stateless migrant, so here we are talking about the domain of the law of foreigners. So the law that needs to be worked on is the law on foreigners. And here is just to summarize the discussion we had yesterday. We had the principles in international law which are imposed on all the states. That is the Convention of 61. So the first is to protect the law of citizenship, and it's all in the context of the human right. And the second is to allow the child who's born on your territory to acquire a citizenship. If otherwise is be stateless. This is a principle that you find in the convention, in the law of children, African Convention, as well as International Convention. Universal law of the registration of birth, in which all the states adhered by signing the convention. So the principle of non-discrimination when it comes to people, the race, and so on, we find it in all the conventions of all that the states have signed or ratified. Then we are quickly going to go. So what is the role of parliamentaries that I would wish that for us to discuss? And first of all, what is your role in order to identify the defiances which are the cause of statelessness? And these defiances are also the cause of a bad treatment that stateless people receive. So how do you what is the role to identify or study these causes? Do parliamentaries need, I don't know the word in French, do they need an outil? Do they need a tool? Do you need a tool to guide you in this task of analysis if the defiances that are the causes of statelessness and the cause of rejection to migrants? And I believe the deputy of DRC was saying that the main cause, the Republic of Congo, one of the causes of xenophobia is ignorance. And yes, one of the causes of statelessness is ignorance. Often parliamentaries or the representative of government do not know that there are defiances in the laws of statelessness. Often parents do not know that they need to register their children at birth, otherwise they will be stateless. So what is the role of parliament when it comes to awareness? At the same time, the authorities, the executive, as well as the population in general. And this time, I'm going to speak to the representatives of the Member of Parliament of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The question of instrumentalization of the nationality. What is the role of parliamentaries? So they say, no, you do not give nationality, but they talk about avoiding statelessness and protect those who are suffering because they are stateless. So another question that I will address to you because I believe it is important in order to answer that question of statelessness. So what is the role of regional parliamentaries? Do they have a role to play in order to eradicate statelessness? I'm talking about parliaments and regional economical communities, the SADC, and also in this parliament we find ourselves today, the Pan-African Parliament. Do they have a role to play? Especially they are most often an aspect of cooperation in order to solve the question of statelessness. I believe it's the deputies from Senegal yesterday that was saying, so we often have the same names in our region or in our countries, and then people don't have proof of documents of who they are. We can find a Diallo in Senegal who's a Senegalese, but then to whom they will say, no, you don't belong here, you belong to Guinea. So how can we resolve that problem? At the level of that we need to put in place mechanism of operation that is will work for the West Africa and Southern Africa and the entire African region. So these are the questions that I wanted to ask in order to lead our discussions. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Emmanuel. Honorable colleagues, this is just like a recap of the session which took place yesterday on statelessness. But the key issues to note here are the prevention, the solution, issuing of citizenship documents, civil registration, protection laws, alien laws, and I think what is mostly directed to us or relevant to us as members of parliament is issues on how to analyze the legal gaps and the tools that we need to deal with the problem, and understanding and sensitizing the people about this challenge and depoliticizing the debate. I remember quite well that this aspect was brought up by Honorable Connie Abubakar from Cote d'Ivoire yesterday, who gave an example of a situation obtaining in Cote d'Ivoire where refugees are given ID cards for the purposes of taking part in the elections. The role of regional parliaments, what role can they play, what role can the PAP play, and the interstate cooperation. So we'll go on and listen to our next panelist, Mr. Kiran Kau, Operations Coordinator, UNHCR, South Africa. You have the floor, Madam.
Good morning, honorable members of parliament, and thank you very much for your attention. I know it's been quite a long and heavy session already. The topic today is about how to develop legislation and build adequate frameworks to address the situations of forcibly displaced persons. I think one thing that has come out very strongly from the discussions, even from this morning and from the past 2 days that you've been privy to, is that there is no one particular group, whether they are refugees or whether they are internally displaced or whether they are stateless persons or whether they are migrants. You will find probably in any situation in an operation where you will have all four people. So when you talk about building adequate frameworks to address the situation of forcibly displaced persons, this will have to be borne in mind. And the other very important thing as well, I think when we talk about the internally displaced, clearly there are links also to the whole discussions that we have about refugees. And a person who is internally displaced in the country of origin may choose to leave the country and become a refugee. A refugee who's outside the country of origin and may choose to come back, may come back into a situation of displacement. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we've heard this word many times throughout today, which is that situation is extremely complex. And in order to build good, adequate frameworks, people will have to bear in mind that there are mixed flows in many, many situations around the world today, which present great challenges. They present great challenges to the asylum system. They present great challenges to providing the right kind of assistance within an internally displaced context. And I think as members of parliament and within the context that we as the international community also do, it's really important to see what kind of legislation and protective frameworks already exist in your country. And I think Africa in particular has been at the forefront of really progressive humanitarianism. It started with the OAU Convention of 1969, which was groundbreaking in so many regards. It expanded the definition of who is a refugee. And in just 10 years, 10 years ago, we had another landmark convention, which was the Kampala Convention. Now, the Kampala Convention also was extremely important for the situation of internally displaced. And a lot of the inspiration for the Kampala Convention came from the work that was done by the then representative of the Secretary General on Displacement, Mr. Francis Deng, into a body of work that's known as the Guiding Principles on Displacement. The reason I bring it up is because when you look at the entirety of what a country has signed up to, some countries may have ratified international conventions which are more human rights conventions or humanitarian law conventions, and some countries may have signed but not yet ratified. And all these things need to be borne in mind in terms of the work that as members of parliament, your role will be extremely important to domesticate some of these responsibilities that have been signed for at an international level. And if you look at some of the paperwork that's been passed around today, there is a particular paper called the Recommendations on the African Union Theme for the year, and also the Pan-African Parliament's contribution towards finding durable solutions to forced displacements in Africa. And here it's clearly outlined in terms of the legislative framework that you can look to, the body of law that your countries have signed up to, and what is it that we need to do to actually make these frameworks workable. Because signing and ratifying, domesticating is one aspect of it. Implementing, advocating, building up capacities, raising awareness, ensuring that public institutions are on board, the coordination that needs to be done in the event of a disaster, for example, the coordination that needs to be done also with other humanitarian bodies like UNHCR, like other humanitarian agencies that it can also come in and support. And these are quite a vast amount of things to think about when we talk about developing adequate frameworks, because you're looking at the adequacy of the response, but also the adequacy of the prevention before a situation escalates. You're also talking about ensuring that there is adequate consultations with the persons who are most affected by this, the meaningful participation that they bring to the table, because they are the ones who know best what to do. So ultimately, I think some of the discussions that would be very helpful today, following my colleague and my presentation now, is to see some of the best practices that you've done, particularly on the work on IDPs, with the work that's been done on refugees, and also to see how best we can engage, across really a variety of stakeholders. Because we heard today about the importance of media. We heard today about the importance of getting support from other countries. There is a regional aspect here where countries can share, their experiences, their needs, their expertise, their technical know-how that they've developed. And with the Global Compact of Refugees, the Global Refugee Forum coming up in December, I think this is a really, really opportune moment for parliamentarians to also see where their role is in terms of the promotion, the advocacy, being a catalyst, talking to the right people within the government circles and bringing people on board. So when we talk about building up adequate frameworks, so these are some of the things that I think would be very, very important to look at in terms of legislation, coming up with good policies in the country, looking to see where people can come together in terms of what kind of programs are best suited, understanding the importance of documentation, looking at strengthening asylum systems, what to do with this whole notion of dealing with the big numbers of migrants that are coming in, how to ensure in any kind of migrant-related legislation that's coming out, that there's always going to be adequate protection for refugees who have a slightly different, well, not slightly, but vast different reasons for coming to the country, which is really to seek protection from persecution or any kind of danger to their life. So these are the kind of things that need to be always brought up at Parliament and be topical. I guess, lastly, what I'm saying is that these are things that really require a lot of thought and topicality in terms of the importance of these issues, because they are cross-cutting. Clearly they are cross-cutting. And I think the kind of discussions that have gone on today have really kind of brought the threads together. So I will leave at this point in time, and very happy to open up the discussions to see some of the feedback from the comments that you will make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In this submission, what came out clearly is that we need to develop legislation to address the situation of forcibly displaced people, and that they are mixed. There's a mixed groups, which poses challenges because their needs are somewhat, or to some extent, different. And we look at the entirety of what the countries have signed up to, and also to take, to bear in mind that signing, ratifying, domestication, and operationalization are two different things. And the importance of media has been noted, and that there's a need for technical support, building legislative frameworks, but the key or the main target or the priority is to have adequate protection for these people who find themselves in these precarious situations. It's time now, honorable colleagues, for interactions, comments, questions, observations. Honorable Kone, Côte d'Ivoire. Yes, please.
Merci. Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the presenters and commend them. But as you said it yourself, Madam Chair, that there is a summary on what we have spoken about for the last 2 days. And I would like to bounce back on the first presentation and talk about the question that the presenter asked, which said, what is the role of regional parliament? Madam Chair, despite the legislative assembly of the Eastern Africa, no regional parliament has a legislative function. And you know as well that these regional parliamentary institutions are born by the will of our leaders. And asking such a questions to parliamentaries, that question will hardly find an answer, because we know very well that the will, for instance, or to leave people freely move in Africa, the will is there, but the political will to make it happen, to have the courage, does not exist. Thank God that we've just put in place the zone of free exchange. I believe that it is not only going to be free exchange of goods, but also for men. So, Madam Chair, I believe that this question, us as parliamentaries, we can only translate the law or the political will, so that political will must exist. We must lead our leaders to understand the necessity of, I know the parliamentary system that Côte d'Ivoire practices And I know that it is difficult in the current state of things to propose laws. In general, there are projects of laws, but when you make a proposition of law and you are in enmity by the minister in charge of that sector, believe that they are biting on his prerogative, but it is not easy. We have colleagues that have tried many times to bring propositions, but I can tell you that those propositions that die, it means that it just ends up in a drawer, even if the texts are clear, but the minister does not let it pass, because for him to let it pass, it is as if they are showing that he is incapable of solving a problem. So, Madam Chair, I would like to come back to that to say that political will must be manifested so that us as the Parliament, we can translate that political will into a law. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Honorable. Senegal.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to join myself to address myself to the two presenters on the two topics. I'm happy to find that we are taking into charge the question of the civil state, the law on birth. The existence of people are linked to these laws. I said it yesterday and I'm repeating that at the African level we have difficulties, and I believe a lot of things have been done at the level of the African Union, and which is coordinated with the statistics institution of the Africans. And why am I talking about this question? It's to say that today it is in synergy at the level of different organizations that we need to be able to solve this problem. So it means today we need to go and question what was done in order to solve this gap that we have in the African level at the registration of births. And my other preoccupation that I have, we have different systems. In certain countries, you see that is unique laws, and others, they have different laws. In Senegal, we have a law of citizenship and registration, and we are working on the code of a child, of children. So at the local level at our countries, we must have a synergy that we mustn't let everyone work at their own corner, and when it comes to protection. And now I want to talk about the role of parliamentaries. I said it yesterday and I will reiterate it. And there are important missions, which are a mission of control. One thing, as you said, and I'm going to agree with the preoccupations that were developed by Madam Mead, and the identification of defiances. I believe we must also add the necessity of going to the follow-up on the implementation. So one thing is rectified, is one thing to sign, but there's another thing to see the application. Do these countries really apply these conventions and treaties that they have subscribed to? So these are the preoccupations that I wanted to bring forward, to say the necessity, as you underlined, to go towards a cooperation. Why am I talking about necessity? Because I believe today, beyond the exchange of experiences, we must go towards an harmonization. Why? Because when you have the problem of regional parliament at the level of the SADC, we have put in place basic principles of movement of people and goods. So in those texts and principles, we must let the cooperation come into play in order to take care of those questions. Those are the contributions I wanted to make, because it is important that the SADC have already evolved in certain aspects. We are going towards the union of a monetary union, so it means we have already evolved in the preoccupation of a level of integration of the regional, and we need to take care of it at that level. I thank you.
Yes, I've seen you, Algeria.
Bismillah ar-Rahman.
In the name of God Almighty. Excuse me, to deal with the issue of refugees, Morocco, with the speakers from Morocco. Morocco is a country now of residence and not just a transit country when we come to refugees. Refugees are a part and parcel of all the community and society. We in Morocco are trying to enforce legislations to organize the citizenship. We try to integrate and protect refugees and migrants and coming to Morocco from different countries in Africa. We are trying to provide them with the necessary means of existence in Morocco and living, education. The Moroccan Parliament is also trying to enforce legislations that protect their human rights without prejudice to the Moroccan principles. Moroccan has always been supportive of the sustainable development of the African people. We're trying also to bring together communities and host communities and communities where the refugees come from in order to have a dialogue that will, with the end result of finding resolutions to eradicate the statelessness. My colleague has also pointed out to the need for African countries to come together and solve African issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, Algeria.
In the name of Almighty God, thank you, Madam President. Thank you for all the present, and I thank you for the pertinent presentations, the first and second presentation. Initially, as we speak about finding solutions for all these issues, sometimes I imagine that, or envisage that I am walking in my, driving my car on an even terrain. After a while, I stop the car. You open and have a look at the engine, and you try to find out why this car is moving up and down. The issue is not in the car. The issue is on the floor, on the ground. It's an uneven terrain. What I mean by this example is that sometimes we start giving much attention to trying to find solutions in the wrong place. We don't look at the realities of the issue and the causes of the problem. And if we try to look at these causes, then we will win. In most cases, we cannot provide the right solutions because we have to go to the roots and try to fix the issues from the roots. For instance, those stateless people, most of them have adapted to these conditions, especially the elderly who have been living in some areas for a long time, and then they don't have any other option, and they don't have other lives. So they only adapt to the situation they find themselves in. There are small communities that also adapted to the conditions, the living conditions they find themselves in. But the problem is the children who comes afterwards, these are the ones who will face problems. We must try to find solutions to these young children. The elderly do not aspire to live in this new generation life, but we look forward to having this new generation, having them as leaders who will build this new Africa. So we need to give more attention to this sector. We must give more attention and make more effort to eradicate the problems from the roots. That is number one. And secondly, try to invest in making legislations that benefits the children and the youth. Those are our future. In Algeria and other countries as well, there are solutions. There are some countries who found solutions, like Rwanda and Algeria. We call from this meeting that we need to find solution for the root causes of the issues. We need also to engage media in finding these solutions. That this is the only way to enable us eradicate the issues of inequality of that faces refugees and the statelessness issue. It's not only, the issue is not only providing them with with humanitarian aid, but the issue is trying to find solutions to stop the causes of this problem. These stateless people need to find themselves a place. You can find someone who's stateless, a stateless woman who is marrying someone from another stateless community, and then you find people, new communities emerging that they have no way in life. They don't belong anywhere, and then they start making children who don't have any place in this world. Legislation is very important. We have to focus on making legislations with the engagement of most government departments and institutions and parliaments. Parliaments are the representation of people from all over. Without this engagement of parliaments and the engagement of people and tribes, we cannot do anything. I wish you well. Thank you.
Honorable colleagues, in the absence of any more contributions from the floor, I will now give the floor to our panelists to give their reactions to some of the comments and observations made during the deliberations. Emmanuel?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your contributions. I agree with the ideas that you have put on the table, the experiences that you have shared, which leads you to formulate these ideas. Beginning with the political will, that is actually the nerve of the war. Because if the parliament has the power to come up with laws, as you say, in different countries, so those laws must be initiated by the executive. So in order to find that political will, you have given ways. So I've heard the deputy of Algeria talking about understanding the causes. In order to understand the causes, you need to have some studies. The studies are not expensive, but you need to understand what are the risks that lead to statelessness. Now, if you understand the causes, then you can defend a policy, and that you can also speak to people who are informed and easily convinced. To obtain information on these causes through some studies, it is essential in order to create that political will. Madam the Deputy from Senegal underlined yesterday and today once again the importance that you as parliamentaries have to question the government as well as your executive. By questioning them, you are also nourishing questions and preoccupations that can eventually lead to that political will. And you also underline the importance of working with media. Media everywhere in the world are the fourth power. They influence the executive. Media, informed media that who are informed on statelessness can also contribute to create that political will. So the question that I asked earlier on was, can the parliament, regional parliament, can they play a role? Yes, certain said, because they can give an impulsion that can also nourish that political will. We saw that when it comes to the CDAO, the parliament, they are already further, they are far in when it comes to statelessness. They have also played a role in that political will at the regional level, which has been translated in the regional level by the only one action plan when it comes to eradicating statelessness. So that is an example to follow. And to conclude, I wanted to say that you essentially know, like the UNHCR got another mandate of the refugees, which is statelessness. And in the framework of that mandate, you must not hesitate to contact us for any support that we can bring in order to do all these studies to find the causes of statelessness, as well as to form the media, to train the media when it comes to statelessness, to analyze the defiances in your laws when it comes to citizenship, as well as treating foreigners. Do not hesitate to contact us to help you understand the causes of statelessness, and also put in place solutions to eradicate statelessness. I thank you.
You have the floor, Madam Kiran.
Thank you very much. I can see the wealth of contributions that have come from all of you who are dealing with various issues in your country as well. And maybe I can pick up one or 2 points which I thought were quite interesting as well. From the Honorable MP from Algeria, you mentioned very much about how people tend to adapt to situations. And I think this is really also a call to recognize how resilient many people who need protection are. But the resilience in themselves, absolutely, they affect particular groups probably, in terms of the needs, protection needs, much stronger. For example, the elderly that you pointed out, or children, for example. So I think when in looking at protection frameworks, in looking at legislative frameworks or policies, keeping people who have very specific needs in mind is extremely critical, because they are really the voices of the generation. Children will always be the voices of the new generation coming. So that's extremely important. From Senegal, I think the point that was made about synergy, I think that is extremely important. I think forums like this that bring different people together, different agencies together, extremely important, because it's the synergy that can lead to better cooperation as well. This is the Pan-African Parliament, and you all here, and you bring so much experience with you. And it's the exchanging of information, but also the will to move that you've all been talking about, the political will that you can build up together here, as a momentum to also influence other sections of the public, the media, etc. So I think there is a big role that you can also play. From Morocco, I think the importance that was made about social cohesion and dialogue was extremely important, because clearly this is something very key when you're talking about different groups of people that find themselves in one particular area at the same time. And the challenges that will come from it will require so much more, much more than legislative frameworks or implementation of the law. This is something that really needs to be tackled at a very grassroots level. So that is something that is very key, and the role that all of you play as, you know, representing the people, the parliament in itself, I think that would be a role that you could also consider. And basically, I think in terms of where we want to go with this and how we can move forward, it's really about the awareness, the interest that we have in promoting some of these principles that we've been talking in the last couple of days, etc., and how that can really translate into better protection and the frameworks that, you know, you can lobby for, that you can really spread awareness on. So this would be some of the things that I think would be food for thought, you know, for taking away from this session. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, honorable colleagues, for your contributions, which have enriched the deliberations on these topics of great importance as we continue to strive to put our best foot forward in this complex and complicated terrain. We do indeed have a sacred duty to persevere, to work out the solutions to these challenges. And to this end, I wish to invite you all to put our hands together for our panelists who have been able to lead us in these deliberations. We have come to an end of the sessions, and we'll have the housekeeping announcements.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to say, if you can still keep to your seats for 5 minutes, and we will proceed with the closing session. Just 2 minutes so that everyone comes in. Thank you very much.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, our honorable members and excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We are here in this fashion to bring to the end and probably another beginning to this conference. And to do that, we will reflect on what we have discussed by reading a communique which basically contains the way forward from here, our deliberations, and how we can move forward with what we've been deliberating on. Thereafter, when the communique has been read, we'll ask our secretariat, led by our acting clerk, to read the communique. I should say up front that it would take us another 2 hours to go through the communique together and make amendments. When the communique is read, we'll seek your indulgence, take note of what you think should be added, left out, and then hand over to the secretariat for any amendments or improvements. After the communique has been read, the Secretary General of the IP, who is with us here, will be formally introduced at a later stage, will comment on the communique and give impetus to it in terms of how we can work together going forward. After the Secretary General will then give a final closing remarks, and that will bring the end of our business of this conference. So on this note, may I call upon the acting clerk of Pan-African Parliament, Mr. Gali, to walk us through the communique. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. With your indulgence, I'm going to go through the final communique, which is not a usual practice, but I'm going to excuse myself. Having said that, I'm going to read the whole declaration. Regional Parliamentarian Conference in Africa to bring about global solution to the refugees for an effective parliamentarian. This was held in Midrand from the 11th to the 13th November 2019. Organized by the Inter-Parliamentary Union, IPU, in cooperation with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and hosted by the Pan-African Parliament, PAP, gathered to discuss how to develop gathered here in Midrand from the 11th to the 13th November 2019. To bring about global solutions for the situation of refugees, for the parliamentarian effective approaches organized by the Inter-Parliamentarian Union in conjunction with the UNHCR and hosted by, welcomed by the African parliamentarian gathered to conceive and to bring about global responses for refugees and the most concerned population, to underscore the exhaustive measures which are inclusive and efficient to bring about solution for the refugees and the internal displaced, the stateless, and to examine the strategies to help them and resolve their own situations in African countries. We commend this very moment for hosting this conference, which is contributing to the topic this year, 2019, which is the year of refugees and the internal displaced, and for durable solutions in Africa. Reminding that Africa is the most touched continent by the flow of refugees and the internal displaced, hosting 26.2 million of displaced, saluting, commending the hospitality of the African countries who are offering to refugees protection to notwithstanding their limited resources, are committed to never forget throughout all our actions that refugees are, first of all, human beings, women and men, young boys and young girls, who are forced to leave their homes, be there for conflictual reasons of human rights violations, persecution, and other forms of violences, and their lives having been tormented. These are the women and men who have abandoned everything, their homes, their families, and their social lives, and have found themselves in a situation more vulnerable with violence and bad treatments, which are the daily lives of the thousands of refugees and internal displaced and the stateless people around the world. We underscore that more than 80% of the people are leaving their home countries as refugees are finding their protection in neighboring countries, where the population due to lack of resources and neighboring conflicts, and reminding that the majority of the host countries are developing countries, and the impact of forced displaced beyond the countries is this is concerning to so many actors and those who are hosting and protecting. We need to underscore that the solutions have to target the refugees and the countries and the hosting communities. We salute the approach, the affirmation on a global compact on refugees, GCR, by the UN General Assembly in December 2018, and reaffirm our commitment to support national efforts to take practical steps towards comprehensive refugee responses, guided by the New York Declaration and the GCR and its comprehensive refugee response framework, and set out in the Nairobi Declaration. Recognize the whole of society approach embedded in the GCR, and hence the multi-stakeholder partnership approach and the increasing involvement of a wide range of actors, from the humanitarian and development sectors to the private sector and civil society, in efforts to find comprehensive responses to refugee situations by assisting refugees, returnees, and host communities. Welcome the holding of the first Global Forum GRF in Geneva on 17 to 18 December 2019. Now that this will be an opportunity to take stock of progress made on comprehensive refugee response frameworks, to make pledges towards implementation of the GCR, and to share good practices, and note with appreciation that such ministerial level meetings will be held every 4 years to enable continued stock-taking on progress on sharing responsibilities to better protect refugees. Believe it is important that parliaments contribute to and take part in this review and commit to following up nationally with our governments regarding their pledges to the GRF and the implementation thereof. Commit to supporting pledges made at the GRF by our respective national governments by taking follow-up action as parliamentarians, such as reviewing national laws in our respective parliaments and committees, and advocating for legislative reforms that address identified gaps or challenges in national systems to facilitate self-reliance for national refugees and other laws as appropriate, specifically with regard to protection and inclusion of refugees in national system to facilitate self-reliance and access to basic services. For instance, education, health, livelihoods, water, and sanitation, and ensuring their inclusion in as well as contribution to creating socioeconomic opportunities together with host communities. Recall that refugee protection includes not only legal and physical protection, but also the ability to lead a meaningful and dignified life while in exile. Emphasize that refugees have skills and capacity to positively contribute to their host communities if given the opportunity, and therefore call on supporting the empowerment of refugees to become self-reliant. Call for solutions to target both refugees and host communities, welcome the more equitable burden-sharing approach anchored in the GCR, and call for greater mobilization of resources and support to benefit countries that host refugees. Call upon intergovernmental organizations, national, regional, and international humanitarian and development partners and financial institutions, the private sector, civil society, and states to redouble the efforts to ease the pressure on refugee hosting communities, supporting countries of asylum to facilitate refugees' self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, improve conditions in countries of origin so people can return in safety and dignity, and further strengthen international burden sharing. Acknowledge and stress that durable solutions entail tackling the root causes of displacement. Stress the need for more effective preventive measures at national, regional, and international levels to strengthen peace and reconciliation processes, and highlight the growing impact of climate change and terrorism as root causes of displacement. Dimensions which will need to be taken into account and design durable solutions and tackling root causes. Agree to support the strengthening of peace building and reconciliation effort with a view to addressing the root causes of displacement through the work of relevant committees in our national parliaments, with a particular focus on women's roles and inclusion and involving forcibly displaced women and youth to effectively contribute to these processes in countries of refuge and or return, or recall the importance of implementing the UNSC resolutions 1325 on women, peace and security. Recognize that good governance, observance of the rule of law, and respect for human rights are the best forms of prevention of conflict and forced displacement, while also contributing to peace, stability, and economic development. Commit to increase advocacy efforts in the fight against xenophobia and stereotypes, with a view to fostering social cohesion between refugees and host communities and enhancing peaceful coexistence, and acknowledge that parliamentarians have a particular responsibility as opinion leaders to bridge gaps and avoid the politicization of humanitarian space, needs, and issues. Agree to advocate for a resolution to existing situations of statelessness in our countries and regions by reviewing our national legislation to ensure its compliance with international standards on prevention and elimination of statelessness and removing any discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, or gender that may cause statelessness. Commit to raising further awareness of UNHCR's I Belong campaign, the Global Action Plan to End Statelessness by 2024, and global and regional legal frameworks that address statelessness. Also commit, as participants of this conference, to establishing an informal platform through the PAP and the IPU to share good parliamentary practices and legislative reforms by our parliaments, and to disseminate this among the parliamentary community. Call upon all international, regional, and sub-regional parliaments and national parliamentarian assemblies across the African continent to accelerate effort to support the creation of alliances to advance the points agreed in this declaration. Also call upon the PAP, the IPU, and the UNHCR, and other relevant organizations to facilitate a wide-ranging debate on aligning national legislation with the GCR and on relevant practices and situations that require our attention, and encourage support for the IPU's pledges to the GRF and for the work of the PEP in follow-up to the 2019 African Year focusing on refugees and displacement. Commit to disseminate and discuss the present declaration in our respective parliaments. Also request the PAP, the IPU, and the UNHCR to widely disseminate this declaration with a view to facilitating its follow-up, and call on them to support national action to facilitate implementation of the commitments made at this conference. Undertake to report back on the various IPU and PAP platforms on concrete action taken. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark of Pan-African Parliament. As I mentioned, if you took note of any improvements, you can then hand them over to the Secretariat. That is the procedure that we intend to follow. And at this juncture, may I invite the Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union to make his comments, contribution, improve, and whatever, give us his own perspectives on the communique and the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished members of Parliament present here. I would like, first of all, to apologize that I was not with you here from the beginning of your conference because I had other commitments, but I had insisted on coming, at least briefly, to share with you some of my thoughts and commitment to the cause of management of refugees in the world today. It therefore gives me pleasure to be here with you and to see many very familiar faces here discussing very important matters regarding the management of refugee flows, especially on the African continent. I do know how important these matters are for you, and I wish to restate our commitment to working with you in order to help you as legislators take the various measures that are required of you with a view to ensuring respect for the rights of refugees wherever they are. I have been briefed on the proceedings that have taken place so far during the past 3 days, and I'm heartened by the forthright commitment that you have displayed in working together as a community of legislators in order to find sustainable solutions to the crisis of refugees and forced displacements. As you will have noticed during the discussions, this issue of refugees, their protection, and their rights are very much at the core of the work that we carry out at the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the global organization of parliaments. And I was here in this same room, virtually from this same seat, addressing a session of the Pan-African Parliament last May when you had a discussion on the management of the refugee situation on the African continent. So the conference that is closing today can be seen as a logical follow-up to the very commitment that the Pan-African Parliament and its members have to the cause of refugees on the African continent. I am pleased that we are able to count on the support of our long-standing partners of the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank them sincerely on behalf of the IPU and I believe on behalf of the Pan-African Parliament for having partnered with us in organizing this very important meeting. I do understand, and I think this transpires very clearly in the declaration that has been read out to you, that you have insisted on stressing the human dimension of displacements. You have clearly stated that behind displacements there are human beings, men and women, boys and girls, that are forced to leave their lives behind them. And you have stated clearly, I understand, that parliaments have a bounden duty to respond to the needs of these vulnerable populations. We know that addressing the plight of refugees and providing support to host communities need to go hand in hand. And
any response has to be comprehensive, addressing both these two dimensions and bringing in on board all stakeholders, including refugees themselves, and allowing the refugees and the host communities to thrive and develop. So we need to come up with a win-win situation, a solution that is beneficial to both the displaced population and the host communities. As you will have noticed during your deliberations, these are not simple matters. And during the past couple of days, you have stressed the point that the response should be to deal with refugees, but also to look at the emergency aspects of the situation. You have also stressed the importance of sustainability, and you have said that any responses to the refugee situation have to take into account the root causes of displacement. You need to look at issues such as conflict resolution, peace building, and reconciliation. You need to look at the issue of governance, how you can improve upon governance within your societies. And any solution would also have to take into account how to address the issues of inequality, security, and climate change. These are issues that can lead to displacement, and it is therefore very important that members of parliament be robust in their response. As we are closing these 3 days of deliberations, I would like, Mr. President, as you asked me to, I would like to just say how we envision follow-up to this conference, because it is not just enough to come and talk, adopt a declaration and go home. There must be that commitment to following up on those deliberations here if we want to continue to be relevant to our societies. And as the declaration has just mentioned, there will be the Global Refugee Forum, or first of all, you remember that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Global Refugee Compact in December last year. And I want to stress that this is an ambitious program of action that seeks to address refugee situations in a most efficient manner. The declaration has stressed the fact that the approach being proposed is balanced and establishes a clear link between refugee protection and the development of host communities. The compact highlights the importance of empowering refugees to become self-reliant and make a positive contribution to their host communities. It also provides for avenues for more equitable burden sharing and sustainable solutions. It seems to me, therefore, that one of the foremost things that you as legislators would have to do would be to support that compact in a very substantive and concrete manner. And the upcoming Global Refugee Forum, which was referred to in the declaration, gives you an opportunity to make a meaningful input into the implementation of the Global Compact. That Refugee Forum, which will take place in December 2019 in Geneva, will be a landmark, and we are in the process of discussing with the organizers, UNHCR, to see how the parliamentary dimension can be brought into the deliberations. And one possibility is to fit the declaration that you have just heard into the deliberations of the forum. We will therefore stress the importance of the forum, and it is going to be the first opportunity since the Global Compact to do an assessment of progress that has been made in implementation of the objectives of that compact. It will also be an opportunity for countries to make concrete pledges towards the implementation of the Global Compact on refugees. These pledges can be financial, technical, and policy related, and that's where you as legislators come in. We are encouraging you to weigh in on your governments so that your governments can come up with very concrete pledges that would enable efficient implementation of the Global Compact. As I have just said, the deliberations of this conference that is closing today will be shared with the Global Forum. And we hope that parliamentarians will be able to participate in a very meaningful way in the deliberations of the forum. But we are encouraging you to also approach your governments back home to make sure that you are in on the conversations that are taking place with a view to preparing for that forum and the implementation of the Global Compact. We think that early involvement of legislators is crucial to efficient implementation of the Compact. Again, we think that making pledges is one thing. Following through with those pledges is another. And that is where we see a strong role for you. When you go back to your various countries, I am sure that you want to use all those powers that are constitutionally ordained for Parliament, and this was well reflected in the declaration. Your lawmaking powers, your powers of oversight over the government, your budgetary powers, and your representative powers. All of these powers you need to use to good effect to facilitate implementation of the Global Compact, especially the implementation of the pledges that your government would have signed up to. It is therefore important, again, as representatives of the people, to sensitize your constituents on the very importance of fluid and efficient management of refugees. We clearly state that the refugee situation is not a crisis, so to speak. It is a phenomenon that has to be managed in a sensitive, sensible, and efficient manner. We have said all of this about the strong role of parliaments, of parliamentarians, but we assume that you all have the capacity and skills and knowledge to fulfill your commitments in terms of managing the refugee situation. Obviously, this is not the case. When we were having the backroom conversation a moment ago, it was brought to my attention that the turnover in parliamentary leadership around the world, especially in Africa, is very high, and it is important that there is an ongoing process of capacity building for parliaments, for parliamentarians, and parliamentary staff, so that at any one moment they have that capacity and they have the skills to perform their functions in a very efficient manner. It is therefore important that we work together, and that is where the Inter-Parliamentary Union and the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees come in, to devise tools that can facilitate the discharge of the functions of parliamentarians. We would like for these tools to respond to the needs that you would have articulated, and here I would like to mention or ask you to take home a number of questions. You have to ask yourself whether your parliament is fit for purpose, whether your parliament is in tune with the issues pertaining to refugee management, whether your parliament has the budgetary allocations, has the requisite structures to deal with these issues, and what type of support these structures would need. The response to those questions would feed into the tools that your development partners, such as the Inter-Parliamentary Union and the High Commissioner for Refugees, could devise to support you. We also want to lay emphasis on the need for devising a parliamentary action plan which would be a roadmap for you as you seek to make a more robust contribution to the management of the refugee situation, including monitoring the implementation of the pledges that your governments make in respect of this issue. We would therefore like to encourage you, and I do this on a sustained basis, encouraging the parliamentary leadership in the various countries as well as the Pan-African Parliament to hold regular discussions on this issue to keep the issue alive, because once again, we are dealing with human beings, men and women, boys and girls. We also would like to encourage you to consider the possibility of establishing virtual platforms. It is not always possible for us to have a meeting such as this one here, but if we could have a virtual network of champions of a refugee cause, this would be very important for carrying forward the refugee management agenda. We want to make sure that in this conversation, parliamentarians are not just having a dialogue between them, exchanging experiences among themselves, but we need to devise inclusive mechanisms where we would bring in various stakeholders, and this is very clear in the declaration that was read out to you. Bring in stakeholders, civil society, research institutions, people who have the knowledge and skills that they can share with parliaments so that parliaments can make informed decisions, decisions that are based on reality and on facts. And here I want to stress the importance of access to information and expertise. Generally, the relationship between legislators and civil society are couched in terms of one trying to play the watchdog role over the other, a relationship that is fraught with controversy. But we do see civil society as a source of expertise, a resource that parliaments should tap into in order to gain the information, the relevant information that is required to promote decisions and policies that are consonant with the interests of the people you represent. Let me conclude by stating that we have had the robust contribution of the IPU Committee to promote respect for international humanitarian law in the deliberations of this meeting. This is the governance structure in the organization that drives our work when it comes to refugee protection and support. We want to make this mechanism available to the parliaments around the world, the expertise that is in there, and I want to thank those members of the committee who have traveled here to South Africa to share their expertise. Mr. Clark, you mentioned in the declaration the campaign, the I Belong campaign to end statelessness. And I just want to say that recently, on 1 month ago, at the IPU Assembly in Belgrade, 2 sets of pledges were adopted. One regarding the I Belong campaign to end statelessness, but the other one, the pledge to support implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees. We believe that these pledges have to be amplified by you, members of parliament, with your various colleagues out there. We believe that you are crucial in forging the political commitment that is required for the implementation of these pledges. We believe that your advocacy role can be very crucial in implementing this pledge. And we think that it is important that we begin to collate the examples of good practice that exist on the African continent in particular, and we are pleased to be able to offer our services to the Pan-African Parliament together with our partners of HCR to see how we can identify these good practices and help you disseminate them throughout the African continent. We hope that we can continue to support you in effecting change at the national level. We hope that in the process, we'll continue to give priority to correcting inequalities, promoting gender equality, but also bringing in the youth component into our conversation. The youth are very important, and I do know that the population of young parliamentarians across Africa is increasing, although, as I continue to say, they're not increasing at a pace that is enough for us to begin to hope for change. I would therefore like to conclude by saying that what we have in front of us is a huge task. It's a formidable task, but it is doable because we believe that there is that political commitment. There should be that political commitment by members of parliament, listening to their communities, engaging with various partners, listening to the plight of refugees, and then being brave enough to take action, because at the end of the day, it is action that matters. I therefore welcome your declaration, the declaration that I hope you will endorse wholeheartedly, because it will then serve as a roadmap for us as we move ahead in forging efficient implementation of the pledges that we make in the context of the Global Refugee Compact. Mr. President, let me use this final moment to say thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for the support of the Pan-African Parliament. I want to record our appreciation to all those who have worked behind the scenes, including the clerk, the interpreters, those who have prepared these documents for us to be able to deliberate in a meaningful manner. I want to thank all of you for your very strong support. And I would like to say that we are committed to working with all of you to make a change in favor of those who have left everything behind, but that we certainly should not leave behind. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Secretary General of the IPU. I think he deserves another round of applause. You have given life to a 3-day-old conference. Your speech was very incisive, very educative, very inspiring. So on this note, let me move to the final closing part of the conference. And I'll make a few closing remarks. My member of the Bureau, who is here, Honorable Boras, Vice President at Pan-African Parliament, Secretary General of the IPU, our distinguished members of Parliament, other valuable distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delivering these closing remarks on behalf of the President of the Pan-African Parliament, Honorable Roger Nkono Dang, who was here when we opened. He did open this conference, but he had to travel because of other commitments. And up front, I need to thank all of you for the commitment to the conference and its theme. People at your level to sit since Monday, contributing, applying your minds to the topic of this conference, I think that should be really appreciated. We do appreciate that you've been around until this time. And I want to thank you also for the deliberations this week. The deliberations gave us an opportunity, a very good opportunity. You will agree that the opportunity was to reflect on our collective efforts and the search for a comprehensive and effective responses to refugee situations on the African continent. And one theme since Monday, one theme which consistently came out during this conference, which I want to thank you for, is that you have said, let us put a human face on the millions of refugees that we talk about. Let's put a human face. Let's not forget our Ubuntu values. So our efforts should be geared towards restoring the dignity of refugees, the displaced persons and returnees. Let us restore the respect and dignity. And on this note, allow me to thank the Inter-Parliamentary Union and the UNHCR for taking the lead in organizing this regional event at Pan-African Parliament. We want to thank you, Mr. Secretary General, representing IPU. We want to thank the UNHCR for working with PAP to make this conference a reality. This cooperative effort should not end today, but should be a regular feature on our calendar to take stock of the progress made on the commitments made during this conference. Please do not forget the commitments that we have made. And the Pan-African Parliament commits itself to monitor the implementation of the recommendations and the spirit and letter of the communique that has been read, which have arose from this conference. Honorable Bureau members, Boras, our members of Parliament participants, it is, as I thank you for the work you have done in the last 3 days, it is sad that after liberating our continent politically, our continent hosts almost 2/3 of the world's displaced, the 26.4 million people. And I want to repeat and say, Africa, you host 2/3 of the world's displaced people. We thought after independence the situation should improve. The 1969 OAU Convention governing refugees speaks loudly to the objectives and the outcomes of this conference. And here we are talking of 1969. The OAU came up with a convention governing refugees. And today, in 2019, we are still talking of 26.4 million people on the continent. What have we been doing since 1969? It is sad that in 2019, we are still grappling with the problems of refugees, and yet our countries are independent. As parliamentarians, let us look at the causes that cause our young men and women, families, displaced persons, and the old to leave our countries and risk their lives crossing borders illegally, others perishing at sea. I've just mentioned the 1969 OAU Convention. We now have the Kampala Convention also, which is celebrating its 10 years of existence. So, AU Convention, 69, now we have the Kampala Convention of 2009. this then brings in another dimension that maybe having convention is necessary. Conventions are necessary instruments to move, but they are not sufficient. And I think this is where parliaments should come in handy. Parliaments are there to monitor, to oversight all these business of conventions, instruments, representing the people, the oversight. Why are we signing this? Because the parliament should ensure that these instruments are put into practice. That's the role of parliament. All these outcomes of conferences, parliament's role is to oversight. We spend resources to come up with all these conferences, conventions. Parliament should then move forward and say, are we practicing? Have we domesticated? Are we complying? You will find that if you read the literature around refugees, you will find that we already have a lot of instruments. A lot of knowledge exists already. But something is lacking. We don't even need new conventions, please, or instruments. We have enough already. What is required is domestication and compliance. And compliance is a parliamentary duty. When you say oversight, that's the role of parliament. But what is more important is to ensure that the causes, and again it's about parliament, what is causing the mass movements of people? Parliament should make sure that these are eradicated. You are the one who allocates resources, budgets. You represent the people. When you do those functions, perform those functions, try and see that are we eradicating some of these weaknesses on the continent. As a continental parliament, the Pan-African Parliament is encouraged by the fact that the UNHCR is calling upon all member states who wish to operationalize the regional instruments on refugees and to access resources from it should go forward, come forward and be assisted. And we hope that the African states will take up this offer by the UNHCR so as to assist and ensure that we have better lives of our refugees. As indicated during the opening ceremony, the African Union declared in 2019 the year of refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons. The Pan-African Parliament will present the key outcomes from this conference, Mr. Secretary General, to the AU Summit in January 2020 as recommendations. So this is very significant. What has come out from here, including the communique, this Parliament in January will present to the heads of state of this continent in January exactly what you have said. And one of the key things that Parliament can do immediately is to conduct census of stateless persons in our respective countries and devise programs to ensure that their livelihoods are improved. The Pan-African Parliament also welcomes the Global Compact on refugees as it aims to ease the pressures on major refugee hosting countries in order to enhance refugee self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, and support conditions for return to countries of origin. This is in our communique, you realize. The PAP, therefore, welcomes the Global Refugee Forum, established by the Global Compact on Refugees, which will be convened in Geneva at the ministerial level on the 17th and 18th of December this year. It is our hope that parliaments will be represented so that they can ensure implementation of the commitments and pledges made at this forum. Honorable members, many recommendations were made during this conference, and these have already been made clear in the declaration, and I will not go into those. But just to say, as I close, that the key issues also emerge. that we have 15 African parliaments and Pan-African Parliament. Mr. Secretary General, Honorable Boras, 15, since Monday, 15 parliaments, African Parliament. That's a significant number. And we should ensure that the outcomes make a change. And that we assist and protect and we have sought to assist to find solutions to the situations on the continent. And this is highly complimented. And I want to thank the conference for contributing to the theme of the AU. The business we conducted in the past 3 days is actually to contribute to what the African Union has been doing the whole year. And we are saying beyond this, let's move forward. And I'm confident that the conference outcomes will then start changing the whole scenario for the better of the 26.4 million refugees. And Mr. Secretary General, you mentioned very good things about the role of Parliament. That should our parliaments fit for purpose? That's a good question and challenge. That our parliament is taking a lead on issues to do with the management of refugees. And when we pass our budgets in our countries, we as parliaments, are we also alive to issues of refugees? What are we doing? And the issue of inequalities in our societies, which are causing some of these displacements. Parliament, we throw the challenge to you that you are at the center. You have been put, you are the only institution in the world whose power is to exercise oversight over the executive, nobody else. Where the governments are not doing well, you are the only one in all the constitutions that have power to oversight and ask questions on this topic. And in that regard, also try and address the issue of inequality as we distribute resources in each country, where there are meager resources, but you should insist on ending inequalities. I can go on and on. This is a very important topic, but let me close by thank you once more, all of you, for participating and sitting in this chamber up this moment. I also want to thank my colleague here, Honorable Boras, a member of the Bureau, for sitting here up to this moment. Mr. Secretary General, you only arrived this morning, you had to travel overnight because of the importance you attach to the topic under discussion. Staff, IPU, PAP, UNHCR, but more so the delegates. Thank you very much. This conference comes to an end on this note. Thank you very much.
Vous pouvez donner l'information? Photo de
Few announcements. Family's photo. Family's photo as announcement. Thank you.
Et s'il vous plaît, les participants sont.
Please, all participants may come forward to have a picture with General Secretary General of the IPU. Thank you. All participants, please come forward for a family's photo with the Secretary General of the IPU. We thank you, honorables.